Thank you, Gleaves. We're so delighted to be a partner with the Ford Presidential Foundation and Museum. I am Michael Van Dennen. I'm the director of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, and we are fourth week into our 8 week. I can't believe we're halfway already in our 8-week program of global conversations with topics suggested by the Foreign Policy Association of America. On behalf of my colleagues, Erica Kubik and Rachel Brooks and Abigail Stead and the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council, thank you for being here both in person and online. And we hope that you'll enjoy this conversation we're having today. It is our mission to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. And we do that with the help of all of you and with the help of enlightened corporate sponsors and educational partners and civic leaders. To change the world, we believe, you first have to know the world. And that's why we do what we do. You can learn more about what we do at worldmichigan.org. We're pleased to host this series with the Foundation and the Museum. Thank you to them. Also, thank you to the great people at GRCC, their video team and the museum video team for helping us live stream this. We also express our appreciation to WGVU Public Media and the Community Media Center for being our communications partners. Let me introduce our presenter for this evening. I've had a delightful time getting to know him today and his first time in the beautiful state of Michigan. So we're glad to welcome him. And we've had a great time. We visited the Frederick Meyer Gardens and the Ford Museum today. And good thing it wasn't last week, Ali. That would have been a little chilly, but it was a beautiful day. We're glad that he's here. As Crisis Group's Senior Research and Advocacy Advisor, U.S.-China, Ali Wyne reports on and analyzes the development of U.S. policy toward China in the U.S. Congress and the executive branch. He helps to formulate recommendations for easing tensions, managing crises, and preventing conflicts between Washington and Beijing. Ali joined the Crisis Group in January of 2024. Prior to that, he worked at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, the State Department, and the RAND Corporation. Last but not least, the Eurasia Group. He has also been a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Snowcroft Center for Strategy and Security and a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute. He is a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the Harvard Kennedy School. Ali is a security fellow with the Truman National Security Project, a former team member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a former David Rockefeller Fellow at the Trilateral Commission. He's the author of America's Great Power Opportunity, Revitalizing U.S. Foreign Policy to Meet the Challenges of Strategic Competition. And he's a co-author of Lee Kuan Yew, The Grand Master's Insights on China, the United States, and the World. Please help me welcome Mr. Ali Wyne.
Can everyone hear? Okay, let me see. I really like these adjustable mics. I haven't seen one that has this kind of adjustability. Can everyone hear me all right? Great. Thank you so much for having me this evening. It's, as Michael said, it's my first time to Grand Rapids. I know that it won't be my last. And just before I even get to the substance of my remarks, I want to say you have in the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, you have a gem of an institution. Hold on to it. I think, please, yes, please. Yeah, I saw somebody applauding. Yes. And it is part of, I think, sadly, a dying breed of institutions. Institutions that I think bring together individuals who want to engage in civil discourse and debate. And I think the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, like its other chapters across the country, I think it invites that kind of dialogue and debate. It models that kind of dialogue and debate, and I think it legitimizes and amplifies that kind of dialogue and debate. So really just, I think, a credit to Grand Rapids that you have such a wonderful institution in your midst. And I do want to, of course, before getting started, to say you not only have a superlative institution, you have the A-plus team at the helm. And I want to just say to Erica, to Michael, to the whole team, Erica, Michael, Rachel, Abigail, four folks. I didn't realize that 4 folks, it's a small shop, but it's the A-plus shop. So thank you so much to the 4 of you for having me. Before getting to the substance of my remarks this evening, I do want to say a few words about the public servant whose imprimatur graces this esteemed institution. I had the opportunity to take a tour with Michael this afternoon. And as I was saying to Michael, and as I was saying to Erica and other folks on the team, I love talking about the U.S.-China relationship, as I think will become evident shortly enough. And I said that I was saying to Erica and Michael, I said I would have been delighted to give this presentation anywhere, and I would have been delighted to give this presentation on any day. But I feel especially honored to be doing so in this really esteemed venue for 2 reasons. The first, and this won't come as a surprise to anyone here in the audience, the first reason I'm so delighted to be here is President Gerald Ford. He was a public servant of surpassing decency. I did a lot of research as I was drafting my remarks for this evening, and the one word that comes up again and again and again when you read biographies of President Ford, all the way from his days as a young man to his days as the President of the United States to his post-presidency days, the word that you hear again and again and again when his contemporaries are asked to describe him, decency, decency, decency. And as I took a tour with Michael of the museum, again, in all of the exhibits, you really get that sense of his fundamental decency. A public servant who very much, he comes from the community, he responds to the community, he never viewed himself as being above anybody else. And so I'm really honored to be here for that reason. And I've also been, I suspect like a lot of you, I've been further impressed by his decency, and I didn't even realize I could be further impressed by his decency. But when I listened to the eulogy that President Ford's son delivered posthumously on his behalf at the remembrance last month for President Jimmy Carter, and I learned in hearing that eulogy, and I hadn't realized this until then, that Presidents Ford and Carter had agreed a long while ago that despite being political opponents, that they would become close friends, and they actually agreed that they would read remembrances, at each other's funerals. And so I went back and I read the eulogy that President Carter delivered at President Ford's memorial in 2007, so almost 2 decades ago. And one of the most poignant and fitting, given how distinguished and esteemed President Carter was, very poignantly and very fittingly, President Carter closed his eulogy for President Ford with the very same sentence with which he opened his inaugural address. And he had just, keep in mind, they were political opponents. Whom had he just defeated to win the presidency? He had just defeated Gerald Ford to win the presidency. So he opens his inaugural address with the same sentence with which he closes his eulogy for President Ford. And I just want to share that line. He says, these are President Carter's words. He says, "For myself and for our nation, I want to thank my predecessor for all he has done to heal our land." 1 line, 21 words. What an extraordinary testament to President Ford's decency. So that's the first reason I'm so delighted to be speaking here as opposed to any other venue where I might be giving this address is I feel that sense, the legacy of his decency. I really feel it in the air and enveloping me. So, and it's really reflected in all the conversations I've had and the warmth that all of you have shown me. So that's the first reason I'm delighted to be here. The second reason, a little bit more immediately germane to what I'm going to be discussing for the rest of the evening, is that President Ford, I think, was very far-sighted in the way that he thought about China policy, very far-sighted in the way that he thought about the bilateral relationship. And he exhibited, I think, a dispassion, a pragmatism that in today's political climate would open him to the charge, the dubious charge, but the very potent charge of being soft on China, weak on China, naive on China. And I don't think that President Ford was any of those things. I don't think he was soft on China or weak on China or naive on China. I think that President Ford recognized, I think far earlier than many of his contemporaries, that this relationship was only going to become more consequential and that these two great powers would have to find some way of getting on. They would have to find some way of cohabitating. And I want to read to you a line from a speech that President Ford delivered to Congress in 1975. Now, just by way of some context, 3 years earlier, his predecessor, Richard Nixon, had signed a document with his Chinese counterpart that came to be known as the Shanghai Communique. So the Shanghai Communique, it's a lengthy document, but the basic upshot of the document was advocating for the normalization of relations between the United States and China, and that normalization indeed came into being 7 years later in 1979. So here's an excerpt from the speech that President Ford delivered in front of Congress on April 10th, 1975, reflecting on the Shanghai Communique. He says, quote, "Stability in Asia and our world require our constructive relations with 1/4 of the human race. Deep differences in our philosophy and social systems will endure, but so should our mutual long-term interests and the goals to which our countries, have jointly subscribed in Shanghai." Now, he said those words in 1975, and half a century later, we can look back on the past half century. There have been momentous changes, momentous upheavals, momentous transformations in international relations over the past 50 years. And I would argue, though, that none of those transformations in international relations over the intervening half a century have done anything to nullify the basic truth of what President Ford said in that speech. And if anything, I would argue that China's resurgence to its present position as the world's second most powerful country imbues President Ford's proposition with even greater truth. His proposition then, and the proposition that I would submit obtains even more now, is that these two great powers, the United States and China, are going to have to find some way of cohabitating, some way of coexisting, some way of commingling. Now, cohabitation, the imperative of cohabitation, of course, it's far more easily articulated than it is accomplished. The United States believes that China wants to overtake it as the world's preeminent power. China believes that the United States is determined to stymie its further development at any cost. And so achieving a constructive competitive cohabitation is going to be very challenging. But what I want to argue this evening is that given the stakes, against the backdrop of a growing risk of armed conflict between these two great powers, I think that the stakes of getting it right are too high, and the consequences of getting it wrong are also too high for us to succumb to fatalism. We have to apply ourselves more energetically and more vigorously to the task of considering what competitive cohabitation would mean. If you rewind the clock a few years ago when President Joe Biden was still in office, in late 2022, he released a national security strategy in which he said that the next decade, after 2022, he said that the next decade is going to be what President Biden called the decisive decade in strategic competition between the United States and China. And obviously, the second Trump administration is going to play an outsized role during that critical window. And so with that context, what I want to do this evening and spend a few minutes is I want to share some initial reflections on where I think the second Trump administration might want to go with China policy. I want to spend a few minutes thinking about how China might respond to those preliminary statements and actions by the Trump administration. And then I want to kind of close by circling back to the really, really esteemed public servant whose imprimatur graces our institution. And then I want to have a conversation with all of you. And the basic point that I want to make on how to think about the second Trump administration's approach to China policy is I think that there are different camps. It isn't clear to me that there is sort of a unified theory of the case. I think that there are different camps within the administration, and I want to briefly outline what I believe to be four of those camps. There are different breakdowns, there are different taxonomies of the camps within the administration, but I think, for my purposes, there are four that really surface. The first consists of the past and present President, Donald Trump. I think that he forms a camp unto himself. And what I find striking about President Trump is that even though it was his first administration that ushered in or at least consolidated what has come to be known as a bipartisan consensus on China policy, I would argue that perhaps the most influential prominent dissenter from that alleged consensus on China is President Trump, for reasons that I'll explain. So how did we get to this notion of a bipartisan consensus on China policy? You'll remember that between, you could say roughly, if I'm bookending it, roughly the arrival of the Nixon administration and the conclusion of the Obama administration, the basic mantra that guided America's policy towards China was encapsulated in this notion of engage but hedge. So let me take each of those words in turn. Engage. President Nixon's supposition was, and I think rightly, his supposition was, we can't afford to allow what was at the time 800 million people living in China. We can't afford to have 800 million people living in isolation, in the cold, in thrall to a revolutionary fervor. He felt that that kind of isolation of such a critical mass of humanity would be dangerous not only to Asia, but to the world. And so President Nixon pursued an opening to China, the famous opening to China. And so that was sort of the engage part. We bring China in from the cold. We integrated into the international order. But there was a second component, hedging. Because the United States and China were then and remain so different in terms of their ideologies, in terms of their approaches to domestic governance, in terms of their conceptions of history, given the gulf between these two countries, the United States believes that it's exceptional. China has a different conception of its exceptionalism. And so the idea was we need to hedge. And that means that the United States builds up its alliances and partnerships, particularly in Asia, but also elsewhere. So that was sort of the mantra that guided America's China policy for, you could say, 35 years, engage but hedge. When the first Trump administration came into office, whether you look at the 2017 National Security Strategy, the 2018 National Defense Strategy, speeches by prominent former officials, including then Secretary of State Michael Pompeo, what those statements, those documents, those speeches suggested was, not suggested, actually declared, was that we had gotten China wrong. Republican and Democratic administrations had gotten China policy wrong. And those documents, those statements, those speeches, they said we had gotten China wrong. We thought that by integrating China into the international system, we would place China on a path towards greater liberalism, towards greater democratization, and towards sort of greater solidarity with the other members of the international community. And the first Trump administration argued that bet didn't pay off. China is becoming more authoritarian. It's becoming more illiberal. It's becoming more coercive. So the first proposition that informs this notion of a consensus is that we got China policy wrong. And these documents frame China in explicitly adversarial terms. They said, this is not the time to mince our words and say, is China a competitor, a partial competitor? No, it is an adversary. So they said, we got China policy wrong. China is an adversary, and we need a new consensus to transform how we conduct foreign policy vis-a-vis China. So that's what is broadly, when we talk about a bipartisan consensus on China policy, those are essentially the core propositions. So coming back now to 2025, and I said that the first camp in this second Trump administration is the president himself, and I make the argument, I think it's a provocative argument, but I think a defensible one, that President Trump is arguably the foremost dissenter from this alleged consensus that his first administration helped to usher in. President Trump does not view China in purely, or I would argue even largely, adversarial terms. And in fact, he has said in recent weeks that the United States and China, I'm roughly paraphrasing him, he says that the United States and China collectively can solve all of the problems of the world by coming together. So he seems to be advocating for what you might call kind of an informal G2, a G2 whereby the United States and China, as the world's two most powerful countries, join forces to stabilize and uphold the international system. And it kind of has echoes of a proposal that President Carter's National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, put forward in an opinion piece that he wrote for the Financial Times in early 2009, advocating for an informal G2. And as far as the personal dynamic between President Trump and his counterpart in China, President Xi, there was one period of time over the past 8 years when there was a real falling out, and that was during the coronavirus pandemic. During the coronavirus pandemic, there was a falling out, and then President Trump in his first administration said, full decoupling is a possibility. I don't want to engage with President Xi right now. He could have done more to stop the transmission of the pandemic beyond China's borders, and he didn't. So there was a falling out in the relationship. But if he still harbors any of that animus towards President Xi, it doesn't seem to be animating him at present. And he has said that he wants to visit China within his first 100 days in office, or perhaps have President Xi visit. And so I would say that when President Trump thinks about the U.S.-China relationship, I think that he views it narrowly through the lens of trade. I think that his principal grievance against China it was during his first term and it remains during the second term, it remains the size of China's trade surplus with the United States, and he wants to narrow the size of that trade deficit. But outside of that grievance against the size of China's trade surplus with the United States, he doesn't seem to be too concerned with other issues that have traditionally aggravated the bilateral relationship. So President Trump, I think, a relatively narrow view of strategic competition. It focuses on trade. He believes that the United States can and should cooperate more forcefully on the full range of issues, and he believes that his personal rapport with President Xi can help to restructure the U.S.-China relationship. So I would say President Trump kind of forms a camp unto himself. That's camp one. Camp two, you might call the existentialists. And these are senior-level advisors who really, as the term existentialist implies, they believe that strategic competition between the United States and China, it is existential. I would put the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, in this category. I would put the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, in this category. And in their conception, strategic competition between the United States and China, it's global. It is zero-sum. There will be a winner. There will be a loser. The stakes are existential. And importantly, for folks who are in this camp, they believe that strategic competition is highly ideological. They believe that Xi Jinping, unlike perhaps any other leader of China since Mao, they believe that he's really powerfully ideological. They believe that he's enthralled to a kind of Marxist-Leninist ideology whereby the East is inexorably rising, the West is inexorably declining, and that in due course, China will reclaim the centrality that it once enjoyed in geopolitics. But for them, the stakes are very, very high, and as I said, existential. Then there's a third camp, and I would place sort of the officials in this camp somewhere between President Trump and Camp 2, comprising the existentialists. Now, the individuals in this camp, they're not starry-eyed about the prospects for the bilateral relationship, and in fact, they're quite pessimistic. But one of the foundational precepts for their way of thinking is that the United States is in relative decline. It doesn't have the wherewithal to wage a global competition against China. It can't compete with China everywhere. And so what the folks in Camp 3 argue is that the United States really needs to train its sights on outcompeting China really in Asia. It should be an Asia focus rather than a global focus, and particularly with an eye to deterring Chinese aggression against Taiwan. So goal number 1, deter Chinese aggression against Taiwan, and goal number 2, reduce the role that China presently has in global supply chains that funnel vital commodities to the United States. That's sort of camp number 3, sort of somewhere between President Trump and Camp 2. And then the fourth and final camp. So Camp 1, at least in my in my conceptualization, Camp 1 has one individual, and I think that Camp 4 has one individual. And I would put Elon Musk in this category. Elon Musk, he is the world's wealthiest individual. He is the owner of one of the world's most influential social media platforms, X. And he has pushed back against this notion of decoupling, or perhaps sort of the softer version of it, de-risking. Although there are many senior advisors in the second Trump administration who believe that the current level of interdependence between the United States and China is unacceptable, there are many senior level appointees in the second Trump administration who are pushing either for more aggressive de-risking or potentially even decoupling. And I think that Elon Musk, he's pushed back, I think, quite forcefully. And if the current reporting is true that President Trump envisions a kind of grand bargain with his counterpart, President Xi, that could really reset the relationship in a fundamental way, I think the Chinese interlocutors believe that Elon Musk could be a useful intermediary in sort of channeling their concerns and channeling their points of view to the president and his high-level advisors. So those are 4 camps, and again, that's my conception of sort of the breakdown of sort of the competing camps in the second Trump administration as of February 25th, 2025. There are many other breakdowns, there are many other taxonomies, and I think that each of them has something to recommend them. That's just sort of my preliminary taxonomy. Now I want to shift over a little bit to how China might be thinking about the second Trump administration, and then I'll conclude with a few remarks on, I think, what President Ford, if he were here today, what he might advise on shaping China policy. I think that China has a number of concerns about the second Trump administration. I think first and foremost, given that China is now, its baseline rate of economic growth has slowed down considerably. If I had been giving this presentation 5 years ago or 10 years ago, we might still be talking about 9% growth or 10% growth. Now the baseline level of growth in China, it's somewhere between 4 and 5%. Demographic decline is starting to bite much more. So today's China is far more economically stressed. It's far more demographically stressed. And for that reason, given that China is dealing with mounting growth headwinds at home, it's worried, I think its first worry about the second Trump administration is the prospective intensification of a punitive economic agenda, whether in the form of ratcheting up tariffs, whether in the form of ratcheting up export controls. So I think that's sort of the first concern that China probably has about the second Trump administration. A second concern is the potential for a kind of rapprochement between the United States and Russia that would blunt the momentum that we presently see in the relationship between China and Russia. And what some folks kind of refer to as a reverse Nixon. The idea for a reverse Nixon is, so during the Cold War, the gambit that the Nixon administration pursued, and it was very successful, it ended up being a very successful gambit, was what can we do so that the United States is pulling China away from the Soviet Union, so that the United States and China are jointly containing the Soviet Union. The idea for reverse Nixon today is, what can we do to pull Russia away from China so that the United States and Russia are jointly joining forces against China? I think that, I would say roughly since 2014, when Russia launched its incursion into Ukraine and subsequently annexed Crimea, I think that 2014 marks a really important inflection point when we see a significant escalation in the tempo and the multifacetedness of the Sino-Russian relationship. And I think that that momentum has continued. I think that China is concerned because of some developments just of recent weeks and frankly recent days. They're concerned that if the United States and Russia sort of newly restore their relations, newly become close, or at least restore some semblance of diplomacy, that perhaps China and Russia might grow further apart, and that Russia might say, hey, perhaps our future does yet lie with the United States and in closer relations with the West as opposed to China. So I think that that's the second concern that China has. The third concern that China has is, frankly, it draws on a memory of the first Trump administration. So during the first Trump administration, I interviewed, for some research that I did at the International Crisis Group, I interviewed a number of former senior officials who worked in the first Trump administration, and I asked them if they could give me an accounting of how the president thought about China policy, how some of his senior advisors thought about China policy, and I asked them to kind of tell me the story of how China policy unfolded during the first Trump administration. And the general account that I got was that when the president came into office, I mentioned that he continues to be concerned with the size of China's trade surplus vis-a-vis the United States, and that was also his concern when he came into office in early 2017. He was concerned about the size of China's trade surplus. And what I've heard from some of his former senior advisors was he came into office with the determination to do a big trade deal with China that would lower the size of the trade deficit between the two countries. And what he essentially said to his senior advisors who wanted to take a more confrontational stance towards China was, look, this is sort of, my box is I'm focused on direct one-on-one negotiations with President Xi. I want to get a trade deal done. And if you take actions that are more confrontational, essentially go for it. He gave them license, so long as those actions that you take don't interfere with my negotiations that I'm having with President Xi. And that compartmentalization worked for the first, I would say, roughly 3 years of the administration. Then COVID strikes. Now, you'll remember, it's hard to remember now, January 15th, 2020, the mood was very exuberant in the White House. After years and years and years of very intensive negotiations, the United States and China do sign that big trade deal. It was known as the Phase 1 trade deals. So in the Oval Office and in other offices in the White House on January 15th, 2020, there were senior American officials, senior Chinese officials, and they were commemorating this breakthrough trade agreement and the potential that it would have to stabilize the relationship. President Trump was in a very exuberant mood because this agreement was something that he had really been hoping to achieve when he took office. Then COVID strikes. And as COVID starts exacting more and more and more of a toll in terms of our healthcare system, our economy, President Trump begins to sour on his relationship with President Xi. He begins to sour on the prospects for the bilateral relationship because he feels that China could have done more to stop the transmission of the pandemic beyond China's borders. And in that moment he feels betrayed by President Xi. He feels that China could have done more to stop the spread of the pandemic. And so in that moment, in that sort of emotional moment, he goes to senior officials who actually had drawn up, as I say in a report that we have on Crisis Group's website, his National Security Council staff had drafted up 16 pages worth of measures that they were ready to take a more forceful stance against China. And they essentially said, Mr. President, just give us the green light. He had been holding off. But once COVID struck and he felt that this relationship was souring, he essentially went to his staff and said, go for it. Whatever measures you have on the books that you've been wanting to implement, go for it. So in the last year of in the first Trump administration, in the last year we see a real convergence. President Trump feels that he's been betrayed by President Xi. His senior advisors have been agitating to take certain measures against China. And so in the last year of the first Trump administration, we see a real coalescence between President Trump and his senior advisors and a real uptick in the pace of activity that the United States takes against China. The reason that I give that history is China realizes, given what happened in the first term, that a comparable exogenous shock to the international system could once again, despite what President Trump is saying now, despite his present sentiments and despite his present statements and actions, China recognizes that a comparable shock to the system could once again bring President Trump into alignment with the existentialists in the current administration. So they do have a range of concerns about this incoming administration, and I think that to manage those concerns, to assuage their own concerns, they're readying a number of lines, and I shouldn't say readying, I think that they're implementing or pursuing a number of lines of defense in parallel. And I would identify, I think, 4 of them. The first line of effort that China is pursuing in response to the second Trump administration is essentially a continuation or an acceleration of what it's been doing roughly, you could say, for about the past 7 or 8 years. The first Trump administration, when it was in office in 2018, it imposed tariffs. It imposed a tranche of tariffs on China, and that was a big wake-up call for China. And one of the conclusions that Chinese officials reached was that regardless of who occupies the White House, Republican administration, Democratic administration, there was a conviction among Chinese officials going up all the way to President Xi that the United States would henceforth, on a bipartisan basis, be committed to thwarting China's continued economic development, its continued technological development. So even though prior to those tariffs, China had been gradually trying to cultivate more technological self-reliance, more financial self-reliance, post-2018, that effort really accelerates. And I think that that effort is only going to continue to accelerate, whether that means trying to do more to gain greater technological self-sufficiency, greater financial self-sufficiency, expanding its set of trading, investment, and infrastructure relationships across the world, particularly in the developing world. China wants to build kind of an economic force field around it to insulate itself from further applications of U.S. economic pressure. So I think that that's sort of the first line of defense that China is pursuing. The second will be, I mentioned that there are at least sort of 4 competing camps of schools of thought within the second Trump administration, and I think that China will try to see if it can drive wedges between those who are perhaps more open to, I think, a more constructive bilateral relationship, who are more open to a kind of grand bargain, who are pushing back against decoupling, and those advisors who, as I said earlier, they view strategic competition in more existential zero-sum terms. And to the extent that President Trump, as I said earlier, to the extent that he wants a grand bargain, I imagine that this time around, President Xi will try to drive a harder bargain and say, if you really want to get that kind of grand bargain across the table, we would like to negotiate with you. We would like to negotiate with others in your administration who are sympathetic to your instincts. But for those advisors of yours who view strategic competition existentially, we don't want them to have as significant a role in the negotiations. So I think that the second line of defense is identifying potential wedge points within the administration when it comes to China policy and trying to exploit those or trying to amplify those. I think the third line of defense that China is likely to pursue is conveying a message to U.S. allies and partners that an America First worldview, an America First mentality is no longer an aberration, but is instead a reality that U.S. allies and partners are going to have to contend with going forward. I think that during the first Trump administration, there was a sense that perhaps an America First worldview, whereby President Trump, he's often quite suspicious of U.S. allies and partners. There was a sense that that view might be an aberration. But now that the president has been reelected, I think that China will try to say, look, even if this particular version of America First doesn't indefinitely guide U.S. foreign policy, you, meaning U.S. allies and partners, you have to assume that some manifestation of this mentality, some version of this mentality will periodically shape U.S. foreign policy going forward, and therefore you'll have to adjust accordingly. So I think that's sort of the third line of defense is what can China do perhaps to drive wedges between the United States, its allies and partners. And then the fourth, I think, and final, line of defense, I think very much related to the third, is to the extent that the United States is withdrawing once more from longstanding, I think, multilateral institutions and agreements, China will, I think, fill in the breach and say that we are upholding the international system rather than presenting itself as a disruptor. So those are 4 lines of defense that I expect that China will pursue. So I want to wrap up in a few minutes, but again, just to summarize briefly, a crude, but I think hopefully somewhat, helpful exposition on some of the competing camps in the second Trump administration on China policy. And I think the result is we're unlikely to see a fully coherent China policy, and I think there will be something of a team of rivals dynamic that plays out in shaping China policy in this administration, just as was the case during the first Trump administration. And then 4 lines of defense that I think Chinese leaders will pursue in response. But what I want to conclude with this evening, and then I probably have spoken actually for longer than I had intended, but I really am eager to get to a conversation with all of you. I want to spend my last few minutes talking not about speculating over what the second Trump administration might do or speculating over how China might respond, but I want to spend a few minutes just talking about the broader stakes of this relationship and circling back to a comment that I made at the outset of my remarks that the stakes of getting this relationship right and the consequences of getting it wrong are both extraordinarily high. I live in Washington. I work in Washington, and something that bothers me, it concerns me, I wouldn't say that it confuses me, but it does worry me, is there's a creeping fatalism that I detect in a lot of the conversations that I have, whether it's with policymakers, whether it's with congressional staffers, whether it's with members of the think tank community, members of civil society, journalists, but the full, the full suite of folks who sort of contribute to the marketplace of ideas. I remember maybe, even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, sometimes when I would talk to friends who worked on the Hill, the question would arise, will the United States and China go to war? Maybe they will, maybe they won't, but there was a question mark. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. What worries me now is that increasingly when I had those same conversations, there seems to be a presumption of inevitability. So in a lot of conversations that I have, folks will say, well, when the war starts, here's how the first week will play out, here's how the first month will play out, and And I'm always sort of taken aback. I say, whoa, we've taken a really major step there of just assuming that this catastrophe is upon us. What about an option in which conflict doesn't happen? And the response that I tend to get, and I think that there's a lot to be said for this response, the response that I get is, well, Ali, look, don't be naive. There are massive structural forces that are impelling these two giant powers, these two great powers. There are structural forces larger than all of us that are impelling these two countries to the precipice of a new Cold War and perhaps even to the precipice of an armed confrontation, a catastrophic armed confrontation. And I don't disclaim the existence of those structural forces. I would be remiss to do so. But my humble response to that line of argument is structural forces exist, yes, but they exist alongside, and I would like to believe are subordinate to, human agency. And it's strange to me when I hear this notion that these structural forces, as though they just arise in a vacuum. Forces don't arise in a vacuum. They are the product of human decisions. It is human decisions that give rise to structural forces. It is human decisions that can bend the trajectory of those forces. It is human decisions that can either lead us to the precipice of catastrophe or can lead us towards the path to a more constructive cohabitation. And so really, if there's any message at all that you take from me this evening, it's that when you hear this argument that there are structural forces in the air around us and that we are hapless bystanders, we're not hapless bystanders. It is our decisions that matter. And everyone here, whether you are a policymaker, whether you are a member of civil society, whether you are a journalist, whether you're a member of the think tank community, whatever your vocation may be, whatever your station might be, telling your members of Congress, telling policymakers that their decisions matter and that they have the capacity to avert a catastrophe between the United States and China. And so as we think about the next 5 years, the next 10 years, really the next several decades of this relationship between the United States and China, which is the world's most consequential bilateral relationship, we do have a choice. Do we succumb to fatalism and say we are prisoners of history, there's nothing that we can do to avert catastrophe, or do we reclaim that sense of agency to avert catastrophe and pursue a path to cohabitation? And I would like to think that if President Ford were here with us this evening, I would like to think that he would agree, and I would like to think that he would urge us all in this room to spare no effort towards those ends. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali. And now it's time to hear from you, from questions from the audience, both in person and online. If you're here in person, you can raise your hand and Michael and I will pass around some mics. You can also text a question to 616-308-6, wait, I've forgotten my own phone number, 616-308-6560, and you can text your question and I'll ask it for you. And while people are thinking of their question, maybe I could ask a starter question. We think about U.S.-China relations as being really driven by business interests over the last couple of decades and seeing business leaders pulling back. Yeah. What do you think the trend will be over the next 4-5 years in terms of businesses trying to negotiate the U.S.-China relationship with the new administration?
It's going to get more challenging. I mean, I think that one of the biggest transformations that's taken place in the bilateral relationship is the role of business, and I think this is commercial considerations. And it used to be the case. I'm being somewhat simplistic, but I think that the broad picture is accurate. It used to be the case that commercial consideration in the U.S.-China context, it used to be the case that commercial considerations were largely dictating security considerations and shaping the relationship, and that the U.S. and Chinese business communities were viewed as essential intermediaries between their respective governments. I think that hierarchy has now changed. I think it is now national security imperatives in both the United States and China that are increasingly dictating the commercial parameters of the relationship. So that hierarchy has changed, and I think that for a lot of multinational companies that have operations inside China, they face a really, I think, unenviable predicament. They're facing growing pressure from the United States that, by virtue of your doing business here, you are contributing to the economy of our greatest competitor, or maybe even adversary. They're also facing growing pressure from a China that is increasingly capable that, look, if you don't sort of do business, operating within certain conditions, we reserve the right to crack down on your operations. They're facing sort of two-way pressure. If you're a multinational, you face geopolitical pressure from the United States, you face pressure from China. But we were actually, Erica, we were having this conversation at dinner yesterday. I think that one of the challenges that a lot of companies face is they're simultaneously trying to manage sort of this growing sort of two-way geopolitical pressure and the reality that I would argue at least, that the rhetoric around de-risking and the rhetoric around decoupling, I think still far outstrips the reality. Even for companies that very eagerly want to diversify outside of China, there isn't some kind of on or off switch. And that's one of the reasons that I actually, I don't quite like the word decoupling, because it implies kind of this binary state that either you have economies that are fused or they're totally, they're totally broken apart. I think many multinational corporations feel that despite what many perceive to be a deteriorating business climate inside China, and despite their desire to diversify operations to, let's say, Indonesia, Vietnam, Mexico, that doing so is a decades-long undertaking. There isn't this kind of on or off switch. So I think that I would say the overall answer is that the next few years are going to be, I think, more and more challenging for businesses that have operations in China. I do think that, as I mentioned in my remarks, I do think that the presence of Elon Musk in this administration, given his outsized influence in the business community, I think it means that there perhaps might be a different kind of conversation about the role of businesses in the U.S.-China relationship. But I think that the overall trajectory is, one, the national security considerations will continue to dictate commercial ones more and more in the relationship, and that multinationals that do have businesses and operations in China, I think that they're going to find themselves under further pressure.
Excuse me. I often hear discussions about China and the U.S. and China, the U.S. and Russia, but there's another elephant in the room that seldom gets brought into the conversation, a sizable elephant, and that's India.
Yes, yes.
Would you comment on how India may play into all these other dynamics?
Absolutely. I'm so glad that, so for folks who didn't hear, the question was that, we hear a lot about the United States and China and sometimes, Russia, but what about, there's another sort of big player in this space, India. I'm really glad I brought up this question. So India has India has a number of, I would say, favorable trend lines. I mentioned sort of China's demographic decline. India's demographic outlook is much brighter. I think if you look at, so demographics, I think if you look at the comparison, or the contrast rather, between China and India, India's demographic outlook, I think, is far more favorable. I think the potential for a higher rate of growth, a more sustainable high rate of growth right now is higher in India than it is in China, whose baseline level of growth is slowing down. I think what India has done exceptionally well, it has a very nimble diplomacy. And what I mean by this, so the foreign minister of India, he has a term, I don't know if he coined this term, but he certainly has done a lot to popularize it. And I think it's not only a brilliant sort of turn of phrase, but it's a very profound term. So the Indian foreign minister, he says a lot that India's foreign policy is one of multi-alignment. And I remember the first time that I heard multi-alignment, you'll remember that during the Cold War, India was famously part of the non-aligned movement. And I remember the first time I heard multi-alignment, I said, well, what's the difference? It's just a prefix. Multi-aligned, non-aligned, what's the difference? But the more that he's brilliant, he's a brilliant diplomat. And so I figured, well, if a brilliant diplomat is insisting on this nomenclature, there must be a rationale behind it. So as I started hearing this phrase more and more and more, I said, well, what does it actually mean? And there's actually a very profound difference, which gets to your question about how India is positioning itself. Non-alignment, at least to my way of thinking, it's passive. You keep your head down, you have one giant, so in the Cold War context, you have the United States bearing down on you, you have the Soviet Union bearing down on you, and you're not aligned. You keep your head down and you're passive. Multi-alignment, I use the word agency as I was closing out my remarks, multi-alignment suggests you're much more aware of your agency and you're much more willing to use it. So whereas non-alignment is passive, multi-alignment is proactive. And very few countries, I would argue, besides India, can say in the same breath, we are strengthening our relationship with the United States, but we also have a residually strong relationship with Russia. We're strengthening our relationship with Israel, but we have a residually strong relationship with Iran. There are very few other countries that are able to sort of juggle relationships that I think for many other countries would come into conflict. And India says, look, we have an obligation to our population of 1.4 billion. We're going to be pragmatic in the conduct of our diplomacy. So what I would argue is that India's role, whether as a potential counterweight to China in the Indo-Pacific, or whether just more broadly in the multilateral order, I think that India's role is going to increase. I will say, though, that precisely because India is multi-aligned, I think that India, in many cases, will, I think, increasingly assert itself against China, but not because the United States instructs it to do so. India will do so of its own volition. And I'll just give one example that I think is telling in this regard. I think one of the real transformations that we've seen in the China-India relationship, and I would say the past 5 years, came in the summer of 2020 when there were the border skirmishes between China and India. They were the deadliest for Indian soldiers since their conflict in 1962. Prior to those skirmishes, the United States had been pressuring India to remove Huawei. Huawei is a Chinese telecommunications company. The United States had been pressuring India to strip Huawei equipment out of its networks. It had been pressuring India to de-risk more aggressively from China economically. And India said, we're mindful, we've taken note of your concerns, we're mindful of your concerns. But India wasn't really playing ball. Once the skirmishes happened that were very deadly for Indian soldiers in the summer of 2020, the big shift that happened was India started aligning more against China, not as a response to U.S. pressure, but of its own volition. And I think that that's what we're seeing now is, similarly, just to give another example, I know you asked about India, but just as a parallel example, take the case of the European Union. So the European Union and China, they had been negotiating for 7 years prior to the Biden administration's arrival. They had been negotiating for 7 years on what's called CAI, Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. And they were just about to get to the finish line that they had been negotiating for 7 years. And then what happens? The coronavirus pandemic happens. There's this outburst of so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, mutual recriminations going back and forth between China and the European Union. And in May of 2021, as a result of the straw that broke the camel's back and these back and forth recriminations, in May of 2021, Brussels says, we're putting a pause on this investment agreement. So that was a decision that Brussels made, not as a response to US pressure, it was a decision that Brussels made of its own volition. All a way of saying that I think that the responses or the attitudes that countries are going to adopt vis-a-vis China, or frankly just the foreign policy dispositions that they're going to adopt more generally, I do think that this notion of multi-alignment, it very much kind of captures the geopolitical zeitgeist. I think that India is kind of the exemplar, but there are other countries that are following suit. You look at Indonesia. Just in the past few months, we've had we had a presidential delegation from the United States, we had a high-level delegation from China, we had a high-level delegation from Russia, Vietnam. Same three countries sent high-level delegations. So I think that what India is demonstrating to the rest of the world, and I think what we see more and more countries in Asia and beyond Asia demonstrating is we don't have to be non-aligned and passive. We can be multi-aligned and proactive. I think that's very much the geopolitical zeitgeist of the times.
And just for a shameless plug, we're going to be hosting Richard Rosso from CSIS March 11th, and he'll be talking about U.S. and India. So if you want more conversations on that, you can come again.
Yeah.
I have a text question. Sure. Doesn't China's approach to Taiwan make war inevitable? No possible compromise?
So my answer both as I'm a hopeless optimist, I'm a congenital optimist. So as a congenital optimist, my answer is no. But also, I think hopefully somewhat dispassionate observer, I think my answer is no. Now, I have to enter a caveat. Whenever you talk about the possibility of catastrophe and say, I don't think that it's inevitable, you always have to stipulate a caveat, which is just because something is inevitable doesn't mean that it's impossible. And we should be very careful not to conflate the two. Look, given how catastrophic a conflict over Taiwan would be, even if I were to believe, or even if we were to believe that there were a 1% probability of a potentially nuclear level catastrophe that would tank the global economy, consign the international order to oblivion, it's a staggering risk and we have to take it seriously. But there are a few reasons why I don't think war is inevitable. The first reason, which I kind of got at in my sort of the last few minutes of my remarks, at the risk of sounding philosophical, and I really don't intend here to kind of delve into philosophy, but I find the presumption of inevitability, it's not only ahistorical, I think it represents a very bewildering abdication of human agency and human responsibility. It's human decisions give rise to structural forces, and yet we, in the same breath, say, well, our decisions have created forces, but now as we see a catastrophe barreling down the tracks, all of a sudden our decisions don't matter, and catastrophe is preordained. I can't square those ideas. I would argue, there are far fewer decisions, or there are far fewer outcomes that are more fundamentally human than the decision to go to war. The decision to go to war is a human decision. The decision to perpetuate war is a human decision. The decision to terminate war is a human decision. So the idea that there are structural forces that condemn us to catastrophe. It's ahistorical, and I think, frankly, it's an abdication of responsibility. So that's the philosophical explanation, but I think it's somewhat grounded in history and politics as well. A little bit more practically and granularly, I do think that frankly, the struggles that Russia is having in Ukraine, I'm not saying that those dispositively shape how China will think vis-a-vis Taiwan, but I think that they inform how China thinks about Taiwan. You'll remember, it's actually almost impossible to remember now, but if we fast forward it, we just marked the 3-year, I don't want to say anniversary because anniversary has kind of happy connotations. But we're marking 3 years of a great tragedy, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If you had said on February 20, so Russia invaded Ukraine, launched its full-fledged invasion on February 24th of 2022. I don't know how many of you remember, but in the days and weeks after Russia invaded Ukraine, there wasn't any discussion, as far as I know, there really wasn't much of any discussion in the West at all about provisioning weapons to Ukraine. Why? The thinking was there's such a huge imbalance between Russia's conventional military armaments and those of Ukraine, plus the fact that, Ukraine has relinquished nuclear weapons, Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal. The thought was that even if we do make a decision as the collective West, even if we make a decision to provision weapons, by the time they arrive, they're not going to make any difference because Zelensky will have been deposed, maybe assassinated, a puppet regime will have been installed by Russia. So initially, there wasn't any discussion, really. But then Ukraine had an occasional fluke. That was how the reporting went. It had an occasional fluke where it would repel this instance of Russian aggression, and then one fluke became 2, became 3, and, a few flukes starts to kind of form a pattern. So Ukraine's bravery in resisting Russian aggression, I think, sort of activated the West to say, well, hey, maybe if we do provision weapons, they can get here in time. But I think if you had said on the day of the invasion that Ukraine would still be fighting 3 years later, that the front line would have barely moved in 3 years, I would have been incredulous. I don't want to speak for anybody else. I would have been incredulous. Ukraine is still fighting 3 years later. And one of the one of the takeaways from Ukraine's resistance to Russian aggression is, if you, in this case, President Putin of Russia, if you essentially succumb to your own hubris, if you isolate yourself intellectually, if you get poor advice from your military officials and your intelligence officials, in part because they probably are afraid of giving you advice that you don't want to hear, you're going to make bad decisions. And I would have to think, if you are, and keep in mind, these are difficulties that Russia is having 3 years on, launching a land invasion of a territorially contiguous neighbor. Now, think about the context of what a cross-strait invasion would take. Staging an amphibious landing, which is what China would have to do in order to invade Taiwan and then annex it, in military terms, there is no more maneuver more complicated, or very few maneuvers that are more complicated than staging an amphibious landing. And I think there's a very good chance that if the People's Liberation Army Navy were to begin traversing the Strait of Taiwan, there's a very high risk, I think, that they would be detected, that they would be interdicted, that they would be challenged in a serious way. So even traversing the Strait of Taiwan would be very difficult. Then Taiwan is building up what it calls its porcupine defenses. The idea of a porcupine is that what can you do to fortify yourself against a conventionally stronger opponent? And so Taiwan, along its borders, it's fortifying its kind of porcupine asymmetric defenses. China would have to breach those. And then Taiwan's geography is also very formidable when it comes to staging an invasion, or conducting an invasion and annexing. So China has to contend with very difficult geography. China also has to contend with the possibility. I mean, if I were President Xi, I would be saying to myself, you all remember Prigozhin in Russia. And at one time, a friend of Putin then ended up, when it seemed like the Russia-Ukraine war was tilting decisively, it seemed in Ukraine's favor, then there was this uprising that Prigozhin led. And so if I were President Xi, I would be thinking to myself, who are the potential Prigozhins in the PLA? If I authorize a Chinese assault against Taiwan, and if it goes wrong, and I think there's a very good chance that it could go wrong, who are the potential Prigozhins within the PLA who might rise up? And so, and there are other reasons that I could deduce, but all a way of saying the argument that I find persuasive, not comforting, but it's not that China will go for the jugular and launch an all-out invasion, but the outcome that I think is likelier, again, it's not comforting, but it's one that in many ways is actually harder to deter, it's harder to prepare for. And I would recommend actually 2 sets of authors, if you haven't already read their work. They really are superlative scholars on this topic. One article by Bonnie Glaser and Jude Blanchett, and another article by Isaac Hardin and Jennifer Kavanaugh. And both of these sets of authors in their articles that they wrote, Bonnie and Jude, their article came out in November, I believe November of 2023, and then Isaac and Jennifer, their article came out in April of 2024. They argued that the United States isn't going to seize Taiwan, but it's going to squeeze Taiwan. What's the difference? Seizure means invasion, annexation. What squeezing means is, what can you do militarily, economically, diplomatically, and so forth, so that on a multifaceted basis, you tighten the noose, you tighten the noose, you tighten the noose around Taiwan with the ultimate objective of grinding down Taiwan psychologically, so that you say to the Taiwanese people, look, annexation, even if we don't annex you formally, that the writing is on the wall, the trend lines are going in this direction, we can do this the easy way, we can do this the hard way. And so I think pursuing this kind of multifaceted strangulation strategy, according to those two sets of authors, it's lower cost, it's essentially what China is doing right now, it's lower risk, and it's harder to deter. Just to take two, and granted these examples are very different, but they illustrate the point. I mean, if you look at what China did gradually in Hong Kong, sort of snuffing out freedom in Hong Kong, or if you look at what China has done in terms of militarizing the South China Sea slowly, those actions didn't take place, those developments or those outcomes didn't occur overnight. They were slow drip outcomes, they occurred incrementally. And they now are essentially facts on the ground. It's much harder to deter something that unfolds incrementally in a multifaceted way than to deal with a shock. And I suspect that a lot of the planning that's currently taking place at the Pentagon and other institutions of the US government, and appropriately so, is preparing for kind of the Armageddon scenario. I suspect that there's a tremendous amount of planning that is actively ongoing for that. So there's dealing with Armageddon, but there's also dealing with scenarios short of catastrophe. And in some sense, while those scenarios are comforting in the sense that we aren't getting to a potential nuclear catastrophe, they're disquieting in the sense that I think they're harder to deter.
How does AI play into the relationship of China and the United States going forward?
I'm sorry, where was the question coming? I'm sorry.
Tour guide from this afternoon.
Yeah, no, I was wondering where it was coming from. Yes, sorry.
How does AI play into the future relationship between China and the United States?
It plays a hugely important role, and I think a role that would have been difficult, if not impossible, to anticipate even 5 years ago. And since you asked, I can't resist offering at least a few thoughts about DeepSeek. I'm sure you all are familiar with the news of just the past few weeks. This paper that DeepSeek published that seems to demonstrate real significant gains in China's China's sort of homegrown artificial intelligence capabilities. I think that one of the determinations that both U.S. officials and Chinese officials have made is that a linchpin of their strategic competition, maybe even the linchpin of strategic competition, will be which country wins the race to achieve the commanding heights of critical and emerging technologies, and of course, artificial intelligence being a critical category of those technologies. The United States, with the CHIPS and Science Act and many other pieces of legislation, many other executive orders, the United States is pouring a tremendous amount of investment into burnishing its artificial intelligence capabilities. China is doing the same. And I think that one of the biggest changes, this artificial intelligence race, and I don't want to call it a race because race implies that there is sort of a defined end state, but this ongoing competition, it's occurring against the backdrop of, I think, one of the most profound changes in the broader bilateral relationship, which is, for the better part of U.S.-China relations since they normalized in 1979, I would say for about 35 years, there was a broadly shared conviction in the United States and China that a baseline level of economic and technological interdependence on net was a contributor to bilateral strategic stability. That conviction now has undergone a complete 180. The conviction now in the United States and China is not only is residual interdependence not a net contributor to strategic stability, it is increasingly a vector of strategic instability. So US officials say, well, this residual interdependence, we essentially are enabling the technological resurgence of our principal competitor, maybe even an adversary. China, for its part, says the residual interdependence that we have with the United States, it gives the United States too much leverage to stymie our further technological development. So increasingly, there's this conversation about de-risking that's taking place in both Washington and Beijing. That conversation is going to intensify. The role of artificial intelligence, I think, accordingly, is going to become even more salient in the relationship. I do want to make a comment just about DeepSeek in particular, and I think it's sort of an interesting timing, given that I'm presenting today. The reactions that I've seen, at least in the United States, and I certainly don't make any claim to have seen the full range of reactions to DeepSeek's paper, but at least the ones that I've seen, There have been some nuanced reactions, I think, to DeepSeek's paper, some reactions along the lines of, it's early days yet, we need to read the paper, we need to look at the footnotes, we need to see how easily replicable its results are, kind of a wait and see approach. It looks impressive, but let's sort of wait and see. But overwhelmingly, the responses that I've seen to DeepSeek's advances in the United States, they've fallen into one of two categories, neither of which I think is helpful: complacence and consternation. Complacence. So here I'm going to, if you'll indulge me, I'm just going to weave in a little bit of just sort of my own sort of story, a little bit of, to personalize this discussion a little bit. So I came of age in the early 90s, and this was when this notion of you all know the notion of the end of history. I came of age in the early 90s when the notion of the end of history, it wasn't just a geopolitical construct, it was very much part of sort of the national zeitgeist. And if my parents were here, they've heard this story many times, and I've probably caused them many gray hairs as a result of the way that I carried on when I was growing up. I had very little interest in politics and international relations when I was growing up. And I think one of the reasons was, coming of age in the 90s, I think that I felt that I had the luxury of being parochial. I think I felt that I had the luxury of being insular about the rest of the world, because it was inconceivable to me in this kind of end of history fervor, it was inconceivable to me, if you had said to me that 30 years on or 35 years on, that China is going to be, in many cases, a near-peer competitor. You have to keep in mind what the discussion was in the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse. The end of history held, the basic upshot was, it's not just that the Soviet Union has collapsed, it's that the Soviet Union's collapse certifies a definitive rebuke to all the various isms that have been challenging the West: authoritarianism, fascism, communism, totalitarianism. And there was a real sense that China was in the United States, there was a real sense that China was on the wrong side of history. It's isolated, it's impoverished, it's on the wrong side of history. And I think that what we're seeing right now is when reality so quickly and so thoroughly intrudes on your expectations and overtakes your expectations, you tend to respond to contrary evidence in, again, one of those equally counterproductive ways. So one response that I've seen to DeepSeek has been complacence. It's probably the result of stolen intellectual property. The advances, there's probably smoke and mirrors. There's nothing to see. Carry on. Business as usual. I don't think that that's useful. I think that we have to acknowledge, and even just my own story. I remember when I was a kid, the story was China can't build, it can't innovate. Then by the turn of the century, well, maybe China can innovate, but only if it steals intellectual property. Now the narrative is, my gosh, maybe it is still stealing intellectual property, but it is really, in its own right, it is a leader of global innovation. So there's this learning curve that I've been on myself. I've had to update a lot of my own assumptions. But then the second category has been, I said complacency wasn't warranted and isn't healthy. The other extreme, which I've seen in response to DeepSeek, and I think in response to China's artificial intelligence advances more generally, is consternation. The sky is falling. How can America out-China China? Our innovation ecosystem it's not doing anything productive. And that's not reasonable. That's not helpful to my mind either. What I think is imperative, not only in responding to China's technological advances, but in terms of right-sizing the competitive challenges, we have to find some kind of midway point, a midway disposition between complacency on the one hand and consternation. And I think it's quiet confidence. And quiet confidence means you don't dismiss the competitive gains that China is making, but you don't aggrandize them either. You don't overestimate your own competitive advantages, but you don't discount them either. And so I think that we have to right-size the competitive challenge for China. I think that we have to recognize that U.S.-China competition is unlikely to be a new Cold War in which there is a decisive victor and a decisive loser. I think that these are two countries that will cohabitate in the realms of critical and emerging technology, in the realms of economics, in the realms of military diplomacy. But I think that if we right-size a competitive challenge, if we focus more on how we can best renew our competitive advantages, rather than allowing China to dictate the terms of our foreign policy, I think that we will be calmer at home, we'll project more confidence abroad. And what I try to advocate in the work that I do at the International Crisis Group, well, we are the International Crisis Group, so my first point of advocacy is how do we avoid war? That's priority number one, priority number two, and priority number three. But alongside that, I think that the sentiment that I try to convey in whatever conversations I have is, what can the United States do to transition away from a China-dictated foreign policy that runs the risk of projecting kind of reactive anxiety? And how do we shift instead towards a China-informed foreign policy that could project quiet confidence? That's the shift that I think that we need to effect, not only in the realms of technology, but even further afield.
We've got just a few more minutes, so I'm going to get this from.
I'll try to give shorter answers too. I'm sorry. I get animated about this subject, and then I do a disservice to folks who want to ask questions. I'm sorry.
This should be a short answer, I hope. If China does decide to take military action against Taiwan, do you think the current administration will honor our security agreement?
This is a tough question. I don't want to get ahead of myself or anybody else. I will just say I think I'll sort of go back to what I said at during my remarks. Just as I said that there are kind of competing camps within the second Trump administration on China policy, I think that there also are competing views on Taiwan policy as well. There are, and I will say, I think President Trump has one view of Taiwan policy. Some of his advisors have different views. So there are just for the purposes of conversation, there are some advisors in his administration, but not just in his administration. There is an increasingly prevalent strand of commentary that says that the United States should abandon its erstwhile Taiwan policy, kind of colloquially known as strategic ambiguity, more formally known as dual deterrence. The idea is that the best way to deter conflict is you keep China on its toes by making China think that if it invades, its worst case scenario will come true, and you deter Taiwan from declaring independence by making Taiwan feel that in a conflict, their worst case scenario would prevail. So the idea of dual deterrence, you're simultaneously deterring China and Taiwan to avoid conflict. There are some advisors in this administration, but also folks in the broader marketplace of ideas who say that strategic ambiguity, per their analysis, has indeed been ambiguous. We have been ambiguous about our commitment, and we've let our deterrence erode, and China is bearing down more and more on Taiwan, and therefore, according to these individuals, we need to abandon strategic ambiguity and embrace strategic clarity, whereby we would make an explicit defensive commitment to Taiwan. So I'm not here to render any judgments. We're only a little over a month in. I would just say that there are competing camps within the administration on China policy, on Taiwan policy. I would just underscore, my hope and my belief that really catastrophic outcome is indeed preventable.
You spoke of how China might view the Russia-Ukraine conflict and have it give them some pause. Could it also work the other way, where they see how poorly Russia has performed relative to how they should have performed? Might that embolden them in some areas?
Yeah. Well, so the question, I don't know if for folks who might not have heard of the question was, so I sort of speculated or postulated during an earlier part of the conversation that Russia's poor performance in Ukraine might give China some pause. What if it works the other way around? And there is, I will say, based on certain conversations I've had, certain work that I've read, China is certainly learning. China is not sitting idly by, and I think that one of the principal lessons that China has taken China's taken several lessons, and I think is probably actively incorporating those into its own planning. So the first lesson is, if you're going to go for the jugular, you need to make sure that you're doing so on the basis of credible military advice and credible intelligence. And if you don't have those, there's a very real risk that an invasion could go wrong. That's lesson one. And it's very notable, you all have heard this data, I'm sure, that the People's Liberation, Xi Jinping has said that he wants the People's Liberation Army by 2027 to have the capacity to launch an invasion of Taiwan. But capacity and intent, capacity and readiness, we shouldn't conflate those. There's a tremendous amount of turbulence right now in the top echelons of the PLA, and I think one interpretation of that turbulence is that while Xi Jinping wants the PLA to be ready by 2027, I don't think that right now he has confidence in the current PLA in terms of its professionalism, in terms of its corruption levels. I think that he feels that it has a long way to go before it would have the professionalism, the integrity to conduct an attack. So that's lesson one, is that if you're going to go for the jugular, you need to get good advice militarily and from intelligence folks. The second lesson is, and Chinese officials have actually communicated as much to their Russian counterparts, you'll remember that when Russia invaded Ukraine first in 2014, that was a smaller scale invasion or incursion, and the West implemented some sanctions, but Russia kind of crowed in the intervening decade between 2014 and 2020. 8 years between 2014 and 2022. Russia crowed about how it had built up what it called a fortress economy in the economic sense. It said we are going to be resilient against sanctions, we are going to be resilient against financial pressure. What Russia, I don't think, anticipated, so Russia, I think, had priced in when it invaded Ukraine in 2022. It had priced in, I think, some certainly significant economic sanctions. I don't think it priced in the scale of sanctions or the speed with which those sanctions would be implemented. The sanctions that the West imposed on Russia, they are the largest scale sanctions that have been imposed since World War II on a country that has an economy of Russia's size. And so Chinese interlocutors have said to their Russian counterparts, before you went all in, invading Ukraine in 2022, you should have done more to build up that fortress economy, diversify away from the dollar. So what is China doing right now? China is accelerating its pursuit of greater technological self-sufficiency, greater financial self-sufficiency. So I would say it could work potentially to your question. Could it potentially work the other way? Yes. If China actively integrates those lessons from Russia's failings in Ukraine into its own planning. But even then, there's so much that can go wrong. It doesn't matter how many war games you conduct. It doesn't matter how much planning you draw up. When a conflict actually starts, we know, not just from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we know really from every armed conflict, whatever plans you've drawn up, they pretty much immediately go out the window, and surprises intervene, shocks intervene, poor decision-making intervenes. And so no matter how many lessons China is taking from Russia's difficulties in Ukraine, I think it would be poor planning to say, well, we've learned everything from Russia's difficulties in Ukraine and now we're ready to go. Yes, you learned those lessons, but there still is so much that could go wrong, and I suspect likely would go wrong if China tried to go for the jugular vis-a-vis Taiwan.
We got, Erica, final question?
I think so, yeah.
Yep, right over here.
And I'm happy to, if folks want to stay after, I'm happy to chat with folks and take more questions.
So really quick question. I see a lot of university students in our audience tonight. What role do universities in each of the countries play in a better understanding and avoiding some of these worst case scenarios? First part of the question. Second part, I guess a comment that I'm looking from you. I'm seeing a lot of talk about ending all these relationships that we have with research institutes in each country, and what implication does that have for our relationships?
Oh, thank you so much. And I actually can't think of a more fitting way to conclude at least sort of the formal part of the evening. I hope more of us will sort of talk afterwards informally. But at least for the formal part of tonight, I really can't think of a more appropriate and important set of questions. At the risk of sounding naive or quaint or old-fashioned, I do believe that not just academic institutions, but I would say more broadly, if you think of sort of the broader sort of ecosystem, the broader intellectual ecosystem, it's colleges, universities, think tanks, they're not only important, they're indispensable. They're indispensable. We were actually, Erica and I were having a conversation at dinner yesterday, and then Michael and I were having a conversation. Where did Michael go? There you go, sorry. Michael and I were having this conversation at lunch. I think that one of the critical roles that ideally, I think that one of the critical roles that educational institutions can play, and I think one of the roles that people-to-people exchanges can play, is fostering strategic empathy. Now, strategic empathy is not to be confused with strategic sympathy. So when you bring together, and this applies at the level whether it's of two governments or two individuals, strategic empathy doesn't mean, so let's say that you and I have some vociferous disagreement, in whatever the issue might be. Let's say that you and I have a very, very strong disagreement. Strategic empathy doesn't mean that we sit down, we break bread, we have a cup of coffee, and at the end of the conversation, we've met each other halfway, and I've come to your point of view or you've come to mine. Strategic sympathy, or strategic empathy rather, means that I'm willing to make the effort of wearing your shoes. I'm willing to ask you, rather than saying, how could you have your point of view? When you ask somebody, how could you have your point of view, you're not inviting a conversation, you're preempting one. You're preventing a conversation from happening. But strategic empathy says, I may disagree with you, but tell me, how did you come to your point of views? What formative life experiences do you have? Who are your formative mentors? Tell me about the journey that you've taken personally, intellectually, professionally to arrive at your views. I may well still, at the end of our conversation, I may well still be as vehemently in opposition to your points of view as I was at the outset. But with strategic empathy, I'm less likely to dehumanize you, I'm less likely to impute malign motivations to you, and I'm more likely to think of ways in which we can, at the personal level, cohabitate. That same principle applies at the level of governments too, and this is where educational institutions play an indispensable role. And where study abroad programs play an indispensable role, where people-to-people exchanges play a vital role. There's something humanizing about seeing someone in person, not over Zoom, I love Zoom, but rather than over Zoom, meeting someone in person. If you'll indulge me just for a minute, because I feel very, very strongly about this point. So when I was in college, When I was in college, I think it was my junior year, I think it was my junior year. In the Student Center, they replaced the Jamba Juice with the Dunkin' Donuts. I promise this is connecting back to the question. And I had I think it was my junior year, and I had this very, very early class in the political science department. It was all the way on the other side of campus. And so kind of to get me out of bed in the morning and also to keep me awake during this morning class, I would go to the Dunkin' Donuts and I would get this giant cup of coffee. And I started spending time there. I like the coffee. I still run on Dunkin'. Ali still runs on Dunkin'. And when I was in college, I enjoyed going there. I felt good when I walked in. And so increasingly, when I would be doing like team projects or doing team papers, so sometimes like a teammate would send me an email or send me a text and say, "Hey, Ali, do you have a few minutes to chat? We can just talk over the phone." And I said, "Why don't we meet at Dunkin' Donuts?" And they would say, "Well, we don't really need to. It'll just take a few minutes." I said, "No," I said, we haven't really gotten to know each other outside of class. Let's get a cup of coffee." Some of the best conversations that I've had, some of the deepest friendships that I've formed that endure to the day, almost 2 decades later, started off in a Dunkin' Donuts. And my friend or my classmate would show up and say, "Well, okay, like we don't really need to talk." But then I'd say, "Well, we're here now." So I think that those kinds of conversations are incredibly important, and I worry about that atrophying of educational exchanges and more broadly of just societal exchanges. We sometimes compartmentalize. I know, lest I be sanctimonious, I sometimes do the same. We sometimes compartmentalize geopolitics and society, but invariably, and we saw this during World War II, we saw this during the Cold War, invariably, intensifying geopolitical frictions have societal spillovers. I worry that there are fewer and fewer American students who are going to China and vice versa. There's huge asymmetry now. I was watching an interview recently with the recently departed U.S. ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns, who is really just an extraordinary diplomat, former ambassador to NATO, most recent posting U.S. ambassador to China. And he gave an interview recently in which he said that at sort of the high water mark point, at one point, I think there was something like 15,000 American students in China. Now there are fewer than 1,000. You can't credibly cultivate the next, and I would say the same on the flip side, you can't credibly cultivate the next generation of China hands in the United States or the next generation of American hands in China if you aren't seeing each other, if you're not learning about each other's cultures, each other's societies, if you aren't seeing each other in person. So educational institutions are not ancillary to the conversation we're having tonight. They are central to the conversation that we were having tonight. And I really hope, and which is why I think, and it's not just to make a plug since I see you and but you know this, it's the reason that I came here, and it's the reason why I believe that institutions such as this one, the World Affairs Council, they're gems. Hold on to them. And just what we've seen this evening, we live in a very polarized time in which people now are talking from sort of one Twitter handle to another Twitter handle. We're not meeting each other in person. And when you're not seeing people in person, you're much more likely to demonize. What I've found is that in these kinds of conversations, what you're doing here this evening, again, as I said at the outset of my remarks, what you're doing here this evening is you are supporting, you are modeling, you are legitimizing, you're amplifying civil discourse, you're demonstrating that civil discourse and debate are possible. We can have a conversation on tough questions, we can debate the answers to those questions, but I think that what you're doing here is so incredibly important. And educational institutions at their best, civil society organizations such as this one at their best, that's what they are doing. They are bringing their combined intellect to bear on the pressing challenges of our time. They are bringing together convening individuals who might not otherwise engage with one another, and they're saying, look, I don't have to agree with you fully, you don't have to agree with me fully, but can we make common cause? And I think that that's a lesson that applies not only in American life, but it applies in geopolitics more broadly. So thank you for asking those questions, but I really, just before concluding, I want to say again, just to Erica, to Michael, to Rachel, to Abigail, to so many others I haven't named, please continue doing what you are doing. You have a gem of an institution here in President Ford's museum. You have a gem of an institution in the World Affairs Council. Please continue what you were doing. Continue doing more programming. Something that all of you can do, something that I'm going to be doing, is you can support these institutions and the work that they are doing. And I really just want to say thank you for having me. Thank you for the vital work that you're doing. And I look forward to seeing you all in Grand Rapids again in the not-too-distant future.
Thank you, Ali, for those kind words, and also just for the great presentation tonight. Lots of food for thought. And next week, join us for another great program. Next time, we'll focus on the Middle East with Raith Alamari from the Washington Institute for Near East Affairs. He'll be coming Tuesday, March 4th 6 p.m. here at the Gerald R. Ford Museum. Thank you all.